Today, I want to talk about Hubert Dreyfus, by all accounts, one of the most visionary and despised men in the history of the field. I want to make it clear that AI is research done by messy human people, and no story makes that clearer than this one. Now, believe it or not, Hubert Dreyfus is one of the most famous scientists ever. One of his students, Eric Kaplan, went on to write for an absurd list of top-tier shows, from Futurama to The Simpsons to Flight of the Conchords, and Hubert Dreyfus is one half of Futurama's professor. But we're not here to talk about Futurama. What we're here to talk about happened way back in the 1950s. We have to go back to AI's original heyday. And if you think AI is hyped today, you have no idea. Back in 1952, MIT hosted this hoity-toity AI symposium, and they invited the who's who of AI influencers back in the day. The most famous demo that happened there was something called the Georgetown IBM experiment, where they demonstrated the perfect translation of 60 sentences from Russian to English. Now, in the 1950s, translating Russian to English was obviously a very important task. And this led to the ridiculous claim that machine translation would be a solved problem in 3 to 5 years. In 1954, mind you, right? 3 to 5 years. Spoiler alert, they were wrong. They were like ridiculously, gratuitously wrong. Still to this day, machine translation is not a solved problem. So today, I really want to talk to you about how were we so wrong? What's happened in between now and then? How could we have seen that, all those years ago? Now, we have to explain just how they got to this notion that machine translation would be a solved problem in 3 to 5 years. To do that, we've got to explain a little bit about the systems that they were using, really what AI looked like back in the 50s and 60s. We have to talk about expert systems. An expert system is a complicated set of if-else statements, generally made by an expert. I put expert in quotes because more often than not, this is a data scientist or computational linguistics. Experts, to be sure, but not necessarily experts in the particular tasks at hand. They are not lawyers, right? They are not social media analysts. They are data experts. They are language experts. And almost without exception, they are PhDs from MIT. All that is to say that expert systems are built by people that believe they are experts, regardless of whether or not they are true experts. The thought goes that if you simply write enough rules, if you write the right rules, then human intelligence will pop open like a Kinder egg at your feet. 70 years and millennia of human effort later, some people are still trying to write the right rules. But back then, in the 60s, AI researchers were convinced that we were right around the corner from a breakthrough. If only we would invest tens of millions of more dollars, a few more years of effort, then we would crack open the egg. In 1961, Dreyfus is still a PhD student in philosophy at Harvard and an associate professor at MIT, so the very bottom of the ladder. And he walks into the lecture of this guy named Herbert A. Simon, who at the time is the guy in AI. He came up with the idea of expert systems. He made some of the demos that would go on to be the most influential ones in that era of AI. He is the guy. He is the top bigwig. And Dreyfus basically decides he's full of shit. He gets so angry as he sees this presentation, and he decides that what AI researchers are basically doing is asserting that they will have solved philosophy in a handful of years by throwing computers at the problem. And to be clear, Dreyfus is completely right. Actually, all of these systems are wrong-headed, and we know that now, looking back, but at the time, Dreyfus was a PhD student, right? Simon was this titan of academia, and even Dreyfus, as smart and as precocious and disagreeable as he was, knew that he couldn't really go against someone like Simon in the situation he was in. So he waited. He kept teaching at MIT. He finished up his PhD at Harvard. And the second he did, he ran off to the Rand Corporation. This is his internship after finishing his PhD. He worked there for someone who would go on to be incredibly influential in the AI field, not as a researcher, but as a manager of some of the brightest minds at the time. His name was Paul Armour, and he worked at Rand. Rand was a big nexus of AI at the time. Today, not so much. They're not the kind of boogeyman like MIT and IBM that you're going to be seeing again and again throughout these. But at the time, Rand was the place to be doing AI research. And so Armour asks Dreyfus to put together some assessment of why AI isn't progressing as quickly as they thought it would. Remember, back in 1954, they said translation was going to be solved in 3 to 5 years. And here we are halfway through the 60s in 1965, and we've not really seen any meaningful progress from this demonstration of 60 translated Russian sentences. Rand wanted to know why. And Rand asked Dreyfus why they hadn't made the progress they thought they should see. And Dreyfus told them exactly what he thought. He puts together this paper called Alchemy and Artificial Intelligence. He compares AI researchers to alchemists trying to change lead into gold based on a theoretical foundation that's little more than mythology and wishful thinking. It's pretty close to a direct quote. So when I say that this is a brutal, brutal paper, right? I mean, Dreyfus absolutely came out swinging. Remember, Dreyfus is correct. The emperor has no clothes, and no serious researcher today debates that point. He argues for something he calls the primacy of intuition, the notion that unconscious human processes, what happens when we read language or look at a basketball, can't be boiled down to rules and bits and bytes. He argues that any AI system that is going to replicate human abilities in these fields must look at this irreducible fuzziness and come up with a way to manage it. He pushed for the ridiculous notion that the current expert systems were only one approach out of many, and that we should measure our results to figure out which one worked better. Unfortunately, at the time, this was seen as some horrific insult to the honor of the gentlemen scientists of the AI community. At the time, believe it or not, these are bold ideas. And so his boss, Paul Armour, is sitting there at the Rand Corporation reading through this report, and it just tears everyone to shreds. And what Armour realizes is that as brutal as it is, he can't actually find any problems with it. Eventually, he decides to publish it. He goes on the record saying that just because he doesn't like the conclusions doesn't mean he shouldn't publish it. And so he publishes it, and it immediately becomes a shitstorm. It rockets to the top of the bestseller list, and the entire AI community comes after Dreyfus. The AI community's response was derisive and immediately personal. Nobody bothered to debate Dreyfus's ideas. Nobody took his criticism at face value and attempted to come up with new techniques that might actually address some of these concerns. No, they called it gossip. They called it a garbage report. They said Rand was garbage for publishing it. They said that he had no idea what he was talking about, that every quote was taken out of context. One of the only AI researchers at the time who I think had any backbone was someone named Joseph Weizenbaum. He was the creator of ELIZA, very, very famous in its own right. You know, one of the few AI breakthroughs of the time to go on to have lasting impacts to humanity. He attacks his colleagues. He calls them out. He says this is no way to treat a human being. He says they're being unprofessional and childish. Of course, he's correct. Unfortunately, nobody listens. So the humiliation just gets worse and worse. They start challenging him to these public exhibition matches against AI. Not that he's ever claimed to be good at checkers or chess, not that he ever asserted that AI could never learn to play checkers or chess, but because they want to humiliate him in a public fashion. Again, nobody ever debates his ideas. No response or rebuttal was ever given to his paper. He was just derided and humiliated in an increasingly grotesque and public fashion. After years of abuse, Dreyfus finally decides he's had enough. He's a tenured professor at MIT now, at the top of the academic world, and yet he's found that his colleagues are unwilling to have a reasoned debate on academic principles. So he leaves. He runs across the country to Berkeley to start all over again as an associate professor. So they bullied him out of school, just like he's the new kid in a YA novel. They forced him to leave. And then Herbert fucking Simon has the gall to write him a letter saying that he should have better humor about it, saying that really it was all his fault. And if he could just learn to take a joke, then maybe people would take him seriously. And that's the end of the story. Herbert Simon wins the Turing Award, basically the Nobel Prize for Computer Science, for his wrong-headed ideas in 1975. Dreyfus basically goes back to philosophy and becomes an incredibly well-respected philosopher in his own right. He occasionally writes in AI, but he's never able to have the kind of traction. The AI community still hates him. Even today, Dreyfus isn't given the credit that he deserves. He's seen as a curmudgeon, someone whose presentation was so unkempt that there was no obligation to take his ideas seriously, that somehow this is his fault and not the fault of the AI community that derided him for presenting ideas that were a little bit too ahead of their time. Hubert Dreyfus was right. And it wasn't until 2012 that someone really came up with an approach that addressed the concerns that he had. That was AlexNet. the shot heard around the world, that showed everyone that deep learning was more than just a passing fad and that it was a transformative technology. Dreyfus predicted decades of AI stagnance, and powerful people just punched down at him again and again and again and clapped each other on the shoulder, telling themselves that they were so smart. Unfortunately, Hubert Dreyfus, known by his friends as BERT, died in 2017. It wasn't until 2018 when one of the most famous AI papers of all time, also named BERT, came out. This paper would be the one that finally showed the masses how right Dreyfus was all along. And I'll do a video about that paper some other day because it absolutely deserves it. But just know for now that that was the first paper to bring widespread acceptance to this notion that language, one of the last strongholds of rules and expert systems, was dominated by this fuzziness that Hubert Dreyfus predicted all those years ago. BERT was right, but in the end, it didn't matter.